morning, everyone. Welcome to our first breakfast briefing of 2025. Bore da, chroeso cynnes I chi gyd I sesiwn hysbysu dros brecwast cynta'r flwyddyn. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome Guto Ifan from Cardiff University's Wales Government Centre and Professor of Applied Economics, Peng Zhou, fresh off the school run and making his breakfast briefing debut, so please be kind to Peng. Guto and Peng are going to be talking about what the Welsh budget announcement on 10th of December means for businesses in Wales very shortly. But before I hand over to them, there's a few things I need to mention. You know the drill by now. So next week is Productivity Week, and to mark that occasion, we are holding an event on Thursday, the 30th of January, with Professor Melanie Jones, who's joining us today. And Melanie is the academic lead for the Wales Forum of the Productivity Institute. Did I get that right, Melanie? Brilliant. So Melanie will be speaking, as well as Robert Lloyd-Griffiths, who's a friend of the business school and from ICAW. Now, we were really looking forward to welcoming Torsten Bell, Swansea West MP, to join us. But you may have seen that Torsten was made the Minister for Pensions last week. And as a result, those ministerial duties mean he's no longer able to speak at the event. So if you've registered, we'll be announcing Torsten's replacement in the next day or so. Another thing I really should mention about next week's event, it's not a breakfast briefing. So please don't turn up at 8 o'clock because there won't be coffee or croissants, but turn up at 3 and we can do Welsh cakes and tea and coffee for you then, okay? Tuesday, 25th of February, we are having a postgraduate study drop-in session between 10 and 2, and that'll be downstairs in the foyer. So if you've ever considered any sort of postgraduate study, an MBA, got some alum in the room today, some MBA alum, please drop in. You don't need to book, call in and see us. I mean, you can speak to us anytime about it, but that's a dedicated day with our admissions team. And last but not least on the list, Wednesday, 26th of March, we are doing a service design course. It's a one-day CPD course led by Sarah Lethbridge, which will arm you with loads of tools, techniques, and the core concepts around service design. It'll help you sort of tailor your services to better suit what your customers' needs are. As always, you can contact us if you've got any bespoke course requirements or want to ask us about events or anything like that. I've handily put John's details up on the screen and not my own, so you can bombard John's inbox instead of mine. So we're recording today's session. Some of you, our regulars, may notice that Wayne's not with us today. Wayne's a bit poorly, so we have Wayne 2.0 in the form of Sarah Lethbridge today, which is slightly better than having John sitting in the hot seat doing it. So bear with us. If the tech looks a bit different today, we're sort of thinking on our feet a little bit. But today's session's recording. All our breakfast briefing recordings are on YouTube, so you can log in there and watch any of our old sessions. So after Peng and Guto have spoken, we'll be going to Q&A. If you're in the room, pop your hand up and John will come round with the mic so you can ask your questions. For those of you at home on Zoom, use the chat function, introduce yourselves, and you can put your questions to Guto or Peng there. And that's it. I can hand over control to you, Peng. I think you're going to speak first.
I don't need that.
You don't need that. Okay. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, everyone in between, and welcome to the briefings. Well, we call it B&B. It's breakfast briefing. Today we are going to have Guto Ifan here to talk about the expenditure side of the budget. Actually, in Cardiff Business School, we have many experts and research institutes specializing in Welsh economy and Welsh policy. I myself is a director of one of the research institutes, Welsh Institute for Research in Economics and Development. Quite a mouthful. We worked on the project on tax devolution back in 2021, and we delivered a briefing to Welsh Assembly back then. But that is about the revenue side. Now we have another side of the equation today. So please let me be accurate to introduce Guto. Guto is a lecturer in politics and international relations at the Welsh Government Governance Centre The centre regularly publishes commentary and analysis on the Welsh Government budget, public services, and Welsh economy. He joined the Welsh Governance Centre in 2015 to work on the governance expenditure and revenue project. So welcome, and I'm looking forward to some interesting clashes between the business school and law school. The floor is yours.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr, Peng. Diolch yn fawr am gwahoddiad ac am drefnu'r digwyddiad yma. Thank you very much for the invitation and for organising this event. I want to start off by talking a bit about the Welsh Government draft budget for next year and trying to analyse the big implications and put it in an historical context and perhaps stress why you as academics, businesses, organisations should pay attention to it. I'm going to start off with the good news, the significantly changed picture for spending for next year and the performance of the Welsh tax base. I'm going to touch upon on taxes as well. And then I'm going to talk about the bad news, which is the difficult fiscal outlook for the Welsh Government budget after next year. Of course, there's been quite a lot of talk over recent weeks about the turbulence in the bond market. And while I don't think it merits the talk of a crisis that we've seen in comparisons to Liz Truss's time in office, I think it does highlight some of the difficult decisions that the Labour government will still have to contend with at some point in time. And I'm going to specifically look at how they've made three mutually incompatible promises around fiscal rules, spending and taxes during the election and thereafter. The government, of course, would say that they'll be able to meet these pledges by increasing economic growth. I'm just going to talk a bit about what that might look like and whether or not they have a credible answer as how to achieve that economic growth. And lastly, in conclusion, I'll be bringing it back to what this all means to Welsh politics over the next 18 months as we approach a Senedd election. I'm aware that I might be straying away from my niche in Welsh public finances at times. There'll be experts in the Cardiff Business School that would be better placed to talk about taxation, the UK economy. And of course, I have colleagues in the politics department better able to talk about Welsh and UK politics as well. But I'm hoping in between all this, I'll manage to say something interesting, vaguely challenging, and some things that you probably can all disagree with. But to begin with the Welsh Government draft budget, and just to give you an overview of how the Welsh Government budget is financed, if we look at departmental spending, so that's spending under the direct control of the Welsh ministers, both for day-to-day spending and capital spending, that comes to about £26 billion. It's quite a significant amount of money. It's about a quarter of the size of the total size of the Welsh economy next year. And the vast majority of that is still financed by a block grant or two block grants from the UK government for day-to-day spending and capital spending. What's changed over the last decade is the devolution of revenue. So the Welsh rate of income tax, more significantly, business rates, non-domestic rates, and smaller devolved taxes, those come to about £5 billion in next year. That doesn't include about £2 billion of revenues from council tax, which also feeds into local services and devolved services. So that's £7 billion of revenues under devolved and local control. So it's quite a step change compared to what we did have previously. You'll also notice the small amount of capital borrowing. There's also flexibility around drawing down from the Wales Reserve, but both of these funding sources are quite small, quite subject to quite strict arbitrary limits set by the Treasury. But the main message from that slide was that its UK government spending decisions is still by far the largest determinant of Welsh Government spending. And I'll talk briefly about the impact of tax devolution later on, but as you've probably heard, at some point or another, the Barnett formula automatically provides a population-based share of changes to UK government spending in England on areas that are devolved to Wales. That's the briefest introduction I've given to the Barnett formula, I think. But the key bit of context for this budget next year is that the transformation that happened at the autumn budget. The Conservatives' pre-existing spending plans that were in place before the Labour Party came into power had suggested incredibly tight spending plans, and there was also little in the way of additional spending commitments in the Labour manifesto. So the headline for Wales, £1.7 billion for the Welsh Government, was quite a step change, It's about £1 billion, we think, more than what would have been implied by previous plans, triggered by top-ups to UK government spending departments. So how has the Welsh Government decided to spend that money? Well, it's perhaps harder than usual to analyse. The way that the Welsh Government presents its budget for the following year is to compare it to final budget plans for the current financial year. So comparing the new allocations to 2025 to final budget plans set back in February. But the budget for this year has been completely changed as well in the meantime, since those, it's been transformed by additional consequentials from both Conservative and Labour chancellors during that time. If we consider day-to-day spending, the Welsh Government revised that baseline to reflect the fact that public sector pay and pension costs were higher than what was originally budgeted for. So that comes to about £652 million that they've added into that baseline so that we can compare their next year's spending plans to that revised baseline. And then on top of that, they've allocated about £1 billion of day-to-day spending. And this shows, as you can see, all areas of the budget increasing in cash terms from this year to next year. The NHS gets about £400 million on top of a similar increase in the baseline. We think that's broadly passing on consequentials from health spending in England. In terms of the local government settlement, it gets an additional £253 million there in the second bar down. That's on top of a baseline increase of £131 million. That's in the context of estimates by the Welsh Local Government Association of spending pressures next year of around £500 million. So we think with council tax increases, with a bit of funding for social care as well in the budget, those spending pressures might be able to be met at a Wales level at least next year. There's also some previous cuts that had been made to other areas of the budget back in October 2023 have been reversed. However, the reason I say that it's a bit more difficult, a bit more trickier to see how spending is changing from this year to next year is because not included in the revised baseline is all the additional consequentials. We estimated about £557 million. Some of that has already been spent or has already been announced in funding. So funding to tackle NHS waiting lists for this year, school spending, culture and art spending this year. This means potentially that the spending changes that we see, or the growth implied by the budget documents, might be overstating the actual eventual increase from this year to next year that we'll actually see. Across the budget for the day-to-day spending, once you add in that additional spending for this year, day-to-day spending is almost flat from this year to next year. So that perhaps underlines just how front-loaded the additional funding from the UK government was. The big increase in spending happens this year. And a significant portion of the additional funding is likely to go towards public sector pay increases. It's been increasing quite rapidly over recent years. The OBR suggests or forecasts that the public sector pay bill at the UK level grows by 5.6% next year. Equivalent amounts for the Welsh Government or devolved and local services would mean about £600 to £700 million of additional spending next year on top of the public sector pay bill this year. On capital spending, there's some inconsistent accounting bases, which thankfully for you, I won't go into. Means the budget documents suggest that capital allocations grow by 18%, but we think it's more like 8% once you account for that accounting change. That said, that's still a really significant increase in the capital budget next year, especially compared to previous trends since 2010, which will need to be spent well in a single year in terms of to improve public services and to boost economic growth. What I want to do next is to look at a longer-term perspective and put this budget into context and specifically look how spending has changed since 2010, or the start of UK austerity measures. Now, there's a lot of caveat assumptions and small print, as you can see, to do with these estimates, but hopefully it paints a broadly correct picture. As you can see, from about 2018-19, the budget started growing again. Successive Conservative Chancellor declared an end to austerity from that point onwards. And you can see that in increasing budgets. If we ignore the main COVID years, Now, next year, total day-to-day spending is about 13% above 2010 levels in real terms. Of course, that doesn't account for a larger population, an older population, and some increased costs for public sector employers during that time. But if we specifically look at NHS spending in the budget, that's increased, that was cut back, during the first years of austerity, perhaps the biggest divergence in budgetary terms that we saw since the start of devolution. And then spending began increasing again much faster than the total budget. However, if we look at the average annual real terms growth over that 16-year period, we're looking at about 2.1% per year in real terms. And that's quite significantly below the historical averages for NHS spending that we've seen since the formation of the NHS of about 3.6%. But that's still left all other Welsh Government spending, from local government, education, transport, business support, environmental protection, housing, etc., to bear the brunt of austerity cuts. And despite increasing, as you can see there, from 2018-19, all of the spending in the budget is still below 2010 levels in real terms. 15 years without any increase in the size of the non-NHS spending in the Welsh Government budget. Also means that the NHS spending has grown as a share of the budget from 41% to 50% this year. Picture is, of course, bleaker if we control or consider population growth during that time. Non-NHS spending is about 8% below on a per-person basis in real terms compared to 2010 levels. The other big divergence in fiscal policy in Wales compared with England and Scotland has been a bigger increase in council tax, which has mitigated some of that, some of those cuts. But of course, that's a regressive way of increasing revenues. Needless to say, these trends since 2010 have had massive implications for all public services in Wales. The health service taking a greater share of resources, but still falling short of meeting increased demand and cost pressures. Demographic pressures starting to bite seriously over recent years, with increases in the share of the population aged over 75. Other public services having to be scaled back, especially considering local budgets have pivoted towards the demands on adult social care. And those cutbacks, of course, across so many areas, have their own implications for the economy, for poverty, for educational attainment, for public health, which again feeds back into the demand pressures facing the NHS. So it's not exactly a pretty picture. So some good news from an unlikely source, maybe. Devolved taxes are my favourite topic of conversation, because the Welsh Government's revenues have been growing faster than the equivalent block grant adjustments. That's the amount of money being taken away from the block grant each year. And those block grant adjustments are linked to what happens to comparable revenue, UK government revenues in England and Northern Ireland. In other words, it's the relative growth in devolved revenues which matters for the Welsh budget each year. The Welsh Government is rewarded if revenues grow faster than those block grant adjustments, and vice versa. That was to provide a sort of incentive for the Welsh Government to prioritise economic growth. And the good news is that the net effect of tax devolution on the budget next year is a positive boost of £317 million. That's not an insignificant amount of money in the budget. It's about 1.4% of day-to-day spending. It's actually not far off how much would be raised by an additional 1p on the Welsh rates of income tax. So even if the divergence on tax policy has been quite limited, the Welsh Government hasn't really countenanced using the Welsh rates of income tax as a policy lever, it has had a budget impact. Tax devolution has been an unheralded budgetary success. Although I'd argue that it's been quite disappointing in terms of changing the nature of Welsh politics and in terms of increasing fiscal accountability as it was initially intended, a point I'll come back to later in the presentation. There was some tax policies in the budget. That's most significantly a 40% relief for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses. These what were meant to be temporary reliefs are now in their, I think, 5th year. The risk is that those reliefs get capitalised into higher rents to the benefit of landlords instead of businesses. And on land transaction tax, the rates payable on higher residential rates on transaction increased by 1 percentage point for each band, broadly following the changes announced for England earlier in the autumn. So that's the good news out the way. I next want to talk about what comes next and the outlook for Welsh Government budgets. And it's worth reiterating the point of just how front-loaded the increase in spending plans of the UK government were. What you can see here is the spending increases, the annual spending increases implied by the spring budget under Jeremy Hunt in blue and the autumn budget under Rachel Reeves in red. And that's perhaps the large increase, shows that large increase in spending happens this year and next. And it reverts then back to quite modest growth in spending, actually cutting back on spending by the end of the forecast period in terms of capital spending. That's good, perhaps, if there are immediate problems that need to be tackled, short-term problems. It's also politically convenient for the Welsh Government facing re-election in 2026. But I think it's more cynically, you can say that it's a trick borrowed from previous chancellors gaming the fiscal rules. It essentially boosts budgets in the here and now and makes cabinet discussions a whole lot easier, but it's back to penciled in tight spending plans beyond next year, the implications of which won't have to be actually spelt out in detail until a full spending review. And those penciled in totals, we don't know the size of the Welsh Block Grant after next year, but those penciled in totals imply quite a difficult outlook for the Welsh Government budget. We await the conclusion of a UK Government spending review in the summer, which will thankfully provide some certainty over multiple years for the Welsh Government. But on current projections, day-to-day spending grows by 1.2% per year on average over the years after 2025-26. Now, if we assume that the NHS gets about 3.5%, if it passes on likely consequentials from UK government spending on the NHS in England, that would mean all of the areas of spending would fall by 0.9% per year in real terms on average from 2025-26 to the end of the decade. That will feel like a return to austerity for many public services. And of course, the outlook for the UK public finances have probably deteriorated since the October budget. The big story, economic story of the last month was the mid-month increase in interest rates and the cost of government borrowing. Interest rates have risen across the G7, but there was somewhat of a UK premium. UK yields on 30-year gilts reached 5.2% in mid-January before falling back later last week. As I mentioned in the introduction, the crisis narrative has probably been overblown. It reflected market expectations for higher central bank interest rates over coming years, the uncertainty perhaps over US economic policy in the wake of the Trump victory. This wasn't a Truss mini-budget event triggered by UK government economic decision-making, in my opinion, but it does, I think, point to some difficult choices the Chancellor will need to face sooner or later during her tenure. And this is because the UK government have arguably made mutually incompatible promises. First, stick to hard numerical fiscal rules. Secondly, to avoid a return to austerity. And thirdly, a promise not to increase taxes, the three main taxes, national insurance, VAT and income tax on working people. But given the state of the UK public finances and the UK economy, this represents a trilemma, in my opinion, for the Chancellor. That is, eventually, you will have to choose 2 points, or one side of the triangle, A, B, or C. Something has to give. The difficulty is compounded by the fact that by the sensible promise to only hold one fiscal event per year. If you take these in turn, so first of all, stick to the fiscal rules. Rachel Reeves has pledged to follow the so-called golden rule, that current spending is matched by taxes over the medium term, and that the debt to GDP ratio falls in the last year of the forecast, I think soon to be 3-year horizon. There was a technical change in the measure of debt to take into account government assets in the autumn budget, which sensibly allowed a welcome increase in the levels of investment. But given low levels of growth, which is below the real rate of interest, the arithmetic means that to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, the the government will need to run a primary fiscal surplus. That's the difference between revenue and spending before interest payments. And that's what the current forecasts imply, current fiscal policy implies for the 3 years at the end of this decade. In other words, the government will be taking more money away in taxes from households and businesses than it gives in spending on public services and social security, to the tune of almost 1% of national income. That's not perhaps a recipe for happy politics by the end of the decade. But the Chancellor left very little headroom against those targets of about £9.9 billion, quite tiny considering the size of the economy and size of the budget, which could easily be wiped out by forecast changes. And that's led to speculation that the spring statement, far from just standing up in Parliament and saying that everything is going to plan, Reeves will have to make some interventions and break the promise not to hold a second fiscal event this year. I'm going to leave aside how silly it would be to fine-tune tax and spending decisions on the basis of unreliable forecasts for the economy and public finances in 5 years' time. But that's what they've signed up to. But that leads us on to point 2 in our trilemma: no return to austerity. That's what was promised during the election. As I outlined earlier, current indicative spending plans imply cuts across many public services outside of the NHS and protected services, considering the likely growth in those protected areas of spending. They need to find about £8.5 billion in 2029-30 to avoid those cuts, having to make those cuts. However, and I guess experience shows that once chancellors have to actually spell out detailed departmental spending plans, total spending plans become larger. However, if the forecasts in March imply a deteriorating fiscal picture, and the government is on course to miss its fiscal targets, then Keir Starmer said last week that the Treasury will be ruthless on public spending cuts. So outside of holding another fiscal event to relook at taxes, the only lever available to pull will be to cut back on public spending. For example, cutting back the planned growth in spending from 1.3% to 0.9% per year would cut planned spending by about £9 billion by the end of the decade. But that, of course, would imply an even trickier spending review. It's important to ask how politically feasible that would be, how compatible that is with the promises made to improve public service performance. Which brings us to point 3, that they've promised to not increase taxes on working people. Just to provide some context, the tax to GDP, tax as a share of national income has been increasing over recent years to historically high levels for the UK, but quite a bit below the average across European countries. And most of that increase, as you can see from the chart, happened under the previous Conservative government. The Chancellor could decide to hold a fiscal event to increase taxes again, but the Labour Party manifesto promised not to increase income tax, national insurance or VAT, by far the 3 largest areas of spending. That constraint was relaxed somewhat at the autumn budget, perhaps by stretching the meaning of the English language and increasing national insurance contributions for employers only, putting the tax burden on businesses. But of course, that will eventually hit working people through lower wages. That unwise manifesto commitment, in my opinion, significantly reduces the political feasibility of coming back again with tax rises in future budgets. And the further away in time that we move from the last budget and from the last government, from the last election, and being able to blame the previous government, the more politically difficult tax increases become. They shied away from quite sensible policies like ending the fuel duty freeze, and also didn't announce very much in the way of tax-efficient reforms. They may have missed the opportunity to pursue broad-based tax increases. The difficulty with increasing smaller, concentrated taxes is that they create and generate a lot of political backlash, as was seen with the agricultural inheritance changes. So if you take the 3 promises, I argue that something will have to give. It's a trilemma. Each option entails political, economic and fiscal risks and trade-offs. Trade-offs, of course, which were roundly ignored by both main parties at last year's election. And this cynical silence over fiscal policy during the election campaign and the ill-judged commitment on taxes will at some stage come back to haunt them, in my opinion. The way out of this trilemma, the Labour government would argue, is through going for growth. Rachel Reeve described the election result as a mandate for economic growth. Keir Starmer said that they're going to be single-minded in their pursuit of economic growth. But I think it's fair to ask, what does going for growth look like in the UK in the second quarter of the 21st century? And do Labour have a convincing answer as to how to achieve it? UK Labour essentially seem to believe that turning up, simply being different to the Tories, would be enough to spur the private sector into action. On the eve of the Six Nations, I'd say it was a similar wishful thinking that made the WRU to bring Gordon Gatland back for a second tenure, hoping that he'd once again paper over the cracks in Welsh rugby, that it was just a management issue, nothing to do with deep structural issues. But just as Welsh rugby is on an unprecedented, prolonged losing streak, the Labour Party has also inherited a UK economy on its own particular dire losing streak. They've run into the reality of a low investment, low productivity, and low growth economy. So even after the worst of the pandemic and cost of living crises, the OBR currently forecasts continued anemic economic growth, about 1.5% in the medium term, with only a short-term boost from what was announced in the budget. The abysmal wage and income growth seen since the 2008 financial crisis is now by now all too familiar and is set to continue. Whilst disposable incomes are around £9,000 lower than they would be had pre-financial crisis trends been sustained. We have Welsh level data from 1971 on disposable incomes. They suggest that recent years have been the worst for living standards have been worse for living standards than any other period, even the late 70s, early 90s, when Wales lost 100,000 manufacturing and mining jobs and an employment average 13%, a period that coincidentally saw a similar decline in the fortunes of the Welsh rugby team. The cost of living crisis exposed those at the bottom of the income distribution in the UK. They are now far worse off than their international comparators across most advanced economies. As the Resolution Foundation put it, we face the twin evils of low economic growth and persistently high inequality. The pandemic and cost of living crisis has exacerbated the weakness of stretched public services, as I've already mentioned. The state of public services and state failure has implications for economic growth through a sicker, less educated population than what we could have. And energy costs are still around 40% higher than 3 years ago, further eroding what's left of the country's industrial base. Now, this is a story that could probably be told across many countries across the world, but I think it's worth pointing out some UK-specific failings and fragilities. The UK is a low investment economy. It's been, for the last 40 years, investing a lower share of the economy each year than all other G7 countries. And this low levels of investment has been a key contributor to lower levels of productivity. The UK also runs persistent current account deficits, making it reliant on foreign funding and lenders, or as Mark Carney put it a few years ago, on the kindness of strangers. The mini-budget acted as a reminder of the potential vulnerability and makes the dangers of the fiscal difficulties that I painted earlier more acute. And of course, the UK economy is part of a world economy beset by massive interlinking crises, with political shocks and instability, trade disruption and tariffs being introduced with implications for a smallish, open economy outside of the EU, geopolitical tensions and wars, and most terrifyingly, climate change, of which the LA fires of last week was just one dramatic manifestation. The economic costs of climate change are becoming ever more obvious and clearer, from mitigation, adaptation, insurance risks, trade disruption, migration, resources, pandemics. In this context, we shouldn't expect a return to normal. I do realise that this is a bit gloomy for a 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, but the message for the Labour government going for growth is that this is uncharted territory. You aren't in Kansas anymore, or more specifically, you aren't in the 90s anymore. As such, I'd argue that a rehashed new Labour managerialism probably won't cut it. The recent turbulence in the bond market will subside, but it is indicative of coming volatility and still leaves the Labour government to find a credible, plausible story of how they're going to get out of this mess. So beyond offering, projecting competence, political stability and fiscal credibility, they've offered a sizable but short-term boost to budgets and a return to austerity in 2026, liberalisation of planning rules, which might have an effect, quite wishful thinking, I think, on making the UK an artificial intelligence superpower. And we've heard about deregulation, particularly in the financial services sector, once again, potentially pumping another bubble in the City of London, and we should all still be able to remember how that can end. On the other side of the ledger, perhaps, they've introduced additional regulation on employment, on rental housing. They've hiked stamp duty and hikes on taxes on employers. They've refused to contemplate liberalisation of trade or free movement with the European Union. They've announced a clampdown on immigration, all of which will have economic effects. But I guess my message is that shifting the performance of the economy, of an entire economy, requires long-term, consistent and persistent direction. And you need to form a narrative to seek the electorate's buy-in as well. And I don't think that we've seen that as of yet from this Labour government. I see little appetite to break with the institutional failings at the heart of the British state and the British economy so far. They haven't been willing to countenance a harder break from the prevailing consensus, neoliberal consensus of economic decision-making in the UK. Surveying the state of the UK economy and the various crises engulfing the world economy, I come to the conclusion, personally, that we'll eventually have to see much greater levels of state intervention, price controls, building resilience to coming crises through strategic stocks of essentials, intervening more directly in energy, housing markets, boosting the living standards and resilience of lower-income households, and bringing taxes further in line with European norms. Politically, and I guess there'll be a lot of disagreement on that, from that half-baked prognosis, and there may be risks of a more radical approach, but I think there's equal risks involved with an overcautious approach too, muddling through and just drifting towards the inevitable next crisis. Which brings me back to my conclusion, which I just want to talk a bit about what this means and pose a few questions on the implications for Welsh politics over the next 18 months. Because we are set for a turbulent 18 months with a Senedd election on the horizon in 2026. Welsh politics is becoming more fractious. Analysis by my colleagues at the Wales Government Centre and the Welsh Election Study shows that the various voting blocs that make up the Welsh electorate that tend to form around national identity lines in Wales are pulling apart in terms of their views on the economy and on society. Polling indicates that we'll see the most hotly contested Senedd election in history, with a realistic prospect that the most successful political party in the democratic world may not win that election, the Labour Party. With incumbents all over the world losing power over the last 12 months, voters are seemingly willing to contemplate alternatives on both left and right. In Wales, we have a newish First Minister wanting to focus on bread and butter issues after last summer's listening exercise. Unsurprisingly, it turns out people want waiting lists to come down and better public services. In an interview on a Popular Politics podcast before Christmas, Eluned Morgan was asked whether there is something fundamentally wrong with this economic system. No, she replied. She went on to say, I'm very clear, the model is okay. How you manage the model is the challenge. A range of measures developed under Mark Drakeford's government have been scrapped or scaled back, unpopular policies thrown out, a definite change in tone and a turn towards a more managerial approach to policy. Also, a change in the relationship between Welsh Labour and its UK counterparts. Long-held Welsh Government positions on the devolution of justice and a fairer funding system have seemingly been sidelined. The risk, I think, for an incumbent government is that this approach also collides with the fiscal and economic reality that I've outlined a bit earlier. Later this year, the Welsh Government will need to set its own medium-term spending plans, potentially having to find significant cuts to public spending. The negotiations to get this budget through the Senedd are proving difficult. The next, much tighter budget will need to pass through the Senedd a matter of weeks before we start an election campaign. If rumours are to be believed, it looks likely that the UK government may give in a little on terms of additional rail enhancement spending for Wales in the spending review. But beyond that, there may not be much to show for having two Labour governments either side of the M4, as we keep hearing about. I commented earlier that although tax devolution has been a budgetary success, it's been somewhat of a paper tiger when it comes to transforming Welsh politics. In contrast to Scotland, the Welsh rate of income tax may have not been touched, didn't really feature in the last Senedd election. The regressive council tax has been allowed to rapidly increase instead, with council tax reform and revaluation kicked into the next Senedd term. So I'll finish with the question in the face of what may be a bleak fiscal and economic outlook. What can the parties, the different political parties in Wales, meaningfully and credibly offer the electorate in 2026? And the key question for me is whether we are willing to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to funding the type of public services that we want to see here in Wales. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much. Very good evidence and argument. I was impressed. May I abuse my opportunity to ask you a first question to start everyone's debate? So basically, I totally agree with you that growth seems to be the only way to break this trilemma. But growth needs people, especially high-skilled people. And Wales seems to be competing with England across the border for these people. We have many people work in England but live in Wales. It seems to be easy to relocate across the border. They can vote by foot if they see this budget is not very well accommodated to their needs. So what do you think the implication from the general picture of this intranational migration? What is the implication of this budget change to people?
Yeah, you're definitely right in terms of the tax base in Wales, the potential income taxpayers that live within 25 miles, 50 miles of the Welsh border. It's in the millions. It's similar in terms of a big portion of the Welsh population also lives close to the English border. If there were different tax rates, for instance, between both countries, you would expect to see some migration. I think it's difficult to say definitively how that would change the picture in terms of if you started to use the Welsh rate of income tax. There's good evidence from the Scottish experience now that sort of pointed towards very high levels. Those on very high levels of income do tend to have relocated from between Edinburgh and London, perhaps. We don't particularly have that sort of tax base here in Wales. There's only quite a limited number of people that earn a very high levels of income. I guess on that point, if you want to raise additional revenues in Wales, you're going to have to increase the basic rate of income tax. Yeah. Because that's where the action is. That's where the majority of people earn their money. And I think broadly, the type of, for the vast majority of people, the type of tax change that might imply, I don't think will spur that levels of high levels of migration in response. I think if you started to change the higher rate and additional rate, you actually might start seeing some of that. Yeah. Whether that reverses the actual increase in revenues that you get, I think probably not. But
just two small points. First, it's very dangerous to compare Wales and England and Scotland and England because the geography is quite different in Scotland. There's a big gap between the two localities. If you want to migrate from Scotland to England, it's much further and more difficult than Wales. That's one thing. Another thing is actually if you adversely drive people out of Wales, it's mostly the most able people because working people are usually more difficult to move. But those high taxpayers, like additional payers, as you said, they will be more sensitive to changes. And it's very dangerous to have this adverse selection in location of residences. But anyway, I think you're given a good answer. And
got a few questions coming through online as well. Should we take one from the room first? I don't know who is
sure.
You see Peng?
Well, let's
one right at the back here. Bear with me.
Okay.
Just a very quick question for me. Is there anything equivalent to foreign direct investment that Wales can do to attract more capitals, or I don't know, something similar to that?
So I guess it's been a particular focus for Welsh Government, particularly, and Welsh policymakers. If you go back to the 1990s, there was a sort of could probably call it glory years of foreign direct investment in Wales. It was it's sort of waxed and waned in terms of the priority that the Welsh Government gives to foreign direct investment, but it's definitely been a focus, has been a focus. There's colleagues in the business school that have sort of Max Monday, for instance, that's done a lot of work on analysing the actual effects of foreign direct investment and the type of jobs, the type of interlinkages with the wider Welsh economy that it creates. But it's definitely has been a focus on the Welsh Government, of the Welsh Government. But I think overall, it's your investment levels across the UK, your business investment levels is the problem. Businesses at a UK level, at the Welsh level, don't invest enough, and that makes up the gap in sort of investment that we see from compared to the UK compared to other developed countries.
Thanks, Guto. We've got a question online. I think we'll go online for the next question. Richie, Richie, are you happy to unmute and ask your question?
There I am. Thanks for that. Sorry, that was a really good presentation. Nice to see common sense taking the floor. You mentioned institutional failings and also cynical silence. And I just wanted to ask about public sector final salary pension schemes. Obviously, the private sector abandoned those 30 years ago. And I think it's the last thing you're not allowed to talk about in finances, public sector pensions. But did you have any views on that, please?
I've got some Welsh Government colleagues sat in front of me, which I don't want to upset anyone. But I think if you look at the sort of the premium or that the private sector has over the public sector at a UK level, it's a slightly different picture in Wales. And the squeeze in terms of public sector wages that we've seen since 2010, I'm guessing that the big offset to that is the more generous pension scheme. I imagine that some public sector employees might actually be willing to forego some of that benefit in terms of the pensions for higher salaries, because ultimately you have to sort of match, if you want to attract people, that's the challenge for public services, to attract enough people. There's skills shortages across the public sector. So you do have to offer something attractive to them. At the minute, it's probably skewed towards pensions that you could probably skew back towards higher pay as a quid pro quo of relooking at public sector pensions, perhaps. But yeah, it's not something that I have particular expertise on, to be honest.
It's the fact that most of it's unfunded, isn't it? The teachers said they need to pay something like 83% of salaries into the pension scheme to have it fully funded. So it is just unaffordable. And I'm not sure in Wales there is such a differential between public sector and private sector pay. Certainly not in my clients. The average working person, I think, you're not able to save for a pension because you're paying it in tax to pay somebody else's pension. But it is, cynical silence. That is I think needs to be addressed. Maybe it's a topic for another session, the business school. But thanks for that. Really
thanks, Richie. Got one question in the room.
Hi, Dan Ward, independent consultant and North Star Transition. Great, really interesting stuff. And one of the things I'm wondering, I'd great to hear your thoughts on, is it seems to me that within Wales Gift, of change is around rental costs, both for households and for businesses. Where for me, this seems to be like it's had huge inflation. It's a real drag on living standards and on people and businesses' ability to spend in the real economy. So it's also dragging on growth. And I was wondering, what your thoughts are on, what Wales maybe could do around trying to kind of, bring in controls on rental, etc. And of course, there is potential, I would see, to link that to things like housing efficiency standards, so that you're encouraging energy efficiency spending.
Yeah, to be honest, it's not something that I have particular expertise on. I know that there's evidence that perhaps that you could look at in terms of the impact of rent controls in Scotland, and how that's impacted the market and in terms of rents. But it's not something that I've particularly looked at. But of course, as you said, it's a key part of driving living standards for households, that increase in housing costs. And if you compare people's incomes before and after housing costs, it's a significant driver of the fact of the poorer performance of disposable incomes in the UK.
Got another question online. Nick Bennett is online. Nick, you happy to unmute and ask your question?
I am. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Guto. Oedd hwnna'n ardderchog. Great analysis. Agree with it all. I think your point really interesting in terms of what are we going to see in terms of, well, maybe pork barrel politics. In the past, Welsh Labour have been able to treat assembly elections effectively as by-elections when they've had a Conservative government in London. That isn't going to be happening next time. What are the benefits of having Labour at both sides of the M4? You've suggested one of the gains will be some softening. Certainly we can all pick that up in terms of rail funding. But, Wales was a major beneficiary of EU structural funds. What are you picking up in terms of the new vision for, the post-levelling up of this new government?
Not much, I guess, is the answer. I think one of the key risks is the shared prosperity fund, and what happens to that after next year. I think it's been talks in the UK level of rolling it into local government finance in England. That's a key risk for Wales. If it was simply treated as departmental spending instead of something different, as you said, we benefited from the fact that we received more EU funding, and the UK government sort of kept that benefit, if you like, with how they allocated the shared prosperity fund. We get about a quarter of the shared prosperity fund in terms of allocations. If that gets rolled into UK government finance, and we're looking at a Barnettized share of that spending, that's quite a drop off from about a quarter to 5.8% or whatever. So that's a key risk. And I guess in terms of levelling up the economy, and that whole agenda, I don't really sense that it's a particular priority for the UK government. You hear more about concentrating on. We've heard more about concentrating on the City of London. I think public investment across the UK will have an effect. As you mentioned, that the rail infrastructure might improve. The regional disparities, but I think probably there needs to be a lot more done in terms of to actually tackle the long-standing regional inequalities that we've seen. And it was meant to be sort of a longer-term plan. Michael Gove talked about 10-year milestones, I think, which was also always going to be difficult to sustain with changes in government, changes in personnel in UK ministries.
I think we're going to try and squeeze two more questions in, one probably from the room and one online. So we could take one from the room first.
Okay, good morning. My name's Jessica Harrington and I'm from Make the Change Consultancy. Thank you again, Guto, for your analysis. Very, very insightful, very, very interesting points that you made. I think for me, regularly speaking to SMEs in Wales, I spoke to a business this week in terms of their payroll is going to increase by £1 million. So it's a huge impact. And asking them how are they going to react to that? There's going to be, you said some of it will be absorbed, but others it will be passing on to other SMEs. So a real challenge. And we talked about growth and the businesses saying that the government saying about how they're powering to pay for all these big public sector payments through growth. What do you think the options are going to be in terms of turning the tanker, in terms of bigging up the economy and supporting the SMEs, which is a big, massive foundation for our economy in Wales?
So that sort of speaks to the point on finding a sort of consistent approach to economic policies. almost giving on one hand and taking away with the other. So if you shift all the tax burden, the tax on employers, at the same time you're asking employers to kickstart economic growth and for the private sector to drive economic growth in the UK. So I think that is a big issue. Personally, I think it would have been much better to get broad-based, to use perhaps VAT, income tax, broad-based tax increases in terms of if you want to minimise the impact, the negative impact on the economy. I think what they actually chose as a way to get around the wording, the particular wording of their manifesto is actually quite an ill-advised tax to use as the main revenue driver in terms of increasing revenues. I think ultimately you do need to increase tax revenues. There are underlying factors from an aging population, the growth in health spending that I talked about, the fact that you can't anymore squeeze budgets that we used to. If you go back 50 years, you could squeeze the defence budget, you could squeeze, more recently, we've squeezed local government finances and other non-NHS spending. That's not an option anymore. So you do need to eventually increase taxes, I think. How you distribute that in the most tax effective way, I think, is a key question. I'm sure that colleagues in the business school have opinions on how best to organise and structure the tax revenues that you do collect.
Thanks, Guto. I'm going to just take one very quick question online. We're almost at the end of our time this morning. Pat Young from the university's governing body is with us this morning. Pat, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the presentation. Look, I'm not surprised given the other pressing demands on public funds that universities don't get mentioned, but I'm not going to pretend I'm not concerned. Looking forwards, looking at the main planks of economic policy, i.e. tax and spend, what do you think the levers are that Plaid and Reform are going to be pushing in the Senate elections?
It's an interesting question. I think in terms of reform, we've heard a half-baked commitment to cutting the Welsh rate of income tax, I think. I guess the key question there is where do you find the savings in the budget to fund those tax cuts? In terms of Plaid Cymru, I think what I'd like to see is a focus on education and skills. I think there's much more pressure that we could put on the Welsh Government in terms of funding. They are responsible for funding universities. They could decide to do something different in terms of education. And quite often, the UK Welsh Government has sort of followed and waited for the UK Government to act in terms of universities, but it is a sector in crisis. And I'd like that to become a topic of conversation and a topic of debate going into the Senate election. I think there's definitely things that the parties could propose in terms of skills, education, universities, that you could do something different in Wales and reorganise how the sector is funded. Of course, that runs into, again, the difficult fiscal outlook, perhaps once again, but that's a part of that wider conversation as well.
Okay, I'm going to finish the session, I think, this morning. Guto, that was such a comprehensive, honest analysis. Thank you so much. I know a lot of work went into preparing for today. I think there are a lot of questions, Sarah, online that we didn't get to. So if you're happy for us to forward them on to you, and please stay and mingle and network. But thank you, Peng. Thank you, Guto, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning in the room and online. Diolch yn fawr.